So a fun fact about Emile Combes is that he originally had been a seminarian. He'd studied for several years to be admitted to the Catholic priesthood, but he would be kicked out after admitting to having some serious doubts about his faith. Worst mistake ever. The 1906 French legislative election took place on the 9th and 20th of May 1906 to elect 592 deputies to the French National Assembly. The last election had gifted a majority to the new Left Bloc, an electoral alliance originally formed to unify the Republic in the crisis it was going through at the end of a previous century. But it now had achieved a mandate to govern past that under the new Prime Minister, Emile Combes. Combes failed at introducing several labor reforms early on, but what he is most remembered for was him leading the most anti-clerical administration yet, even more so than his predecessor. It politically was a necessity, as this was a particular issue that all the different parties of the bloc could agree on. In his first speech before the House of Deputies, Combes would declare war upon what he called the clerical danger that threatened the Republic. Combes began by applying the Liberty of Association Law of 1901. The law had nearly established an unlimited right of association, but it did have an important exception, in that it didn't apply to organizations that were loyal to a foreign power. This meant that the law did not protect Catholic religious orders, as they legally were loyal to the Vatican, and not to France. Just within his first year in office, Combes would sign decrees that would forcibly close over 100 Catholic schools. He would extend a Ferry-era law regarding religious instruction to cover private education too, and would pass a law to start the process of all instruction by an ordained person being phased out over the next decade. The most authoritarian of these measures would come in March 1803, when a law proposal to expel religious orders from France would be debated and passed in Parliament. Out of 58 Catholic religious orders present in France, all but 5 would be made to either laicize or leave France, with most picking the latter option. This attack on their faith would push many French Catholics to consider exile, with even Henry de Gaulle being forced to send his son to Belgium for him to get a Catholic education. Mass protests would erupt in the more conservative parts of France, such as Brittany and Normandy, but their pleas would be ignored by Combes and his cabinet, who were too far in to simply reverse course. However, by the end of 1804, Combes was starting to lose his grip on power. He had been able to get many of his policies through in a short amount of time, but that had been only thanks to his dominant and sometimes authoritarian personality that many of his political allies came to resent. There were many incidents outside even the political sphere, as Combes pressured many local newspapers and Masonic lodges to spread the message of his government, with Catholics often becoming the targets of personal attacks and harassment, with significant although rare events of violence against them. 1904 was the year that Combes' rule was undermined by infighting in his coalition, largely caused by members of the Democratic Alliance and moderate radicals becoming wary of the support and confidence the socialists had been giving the Combes administration. This infighting would eventually cause his government to collapse. In January 1905, after Combes failed to maneuver around the House to pass laws creating an income tax and a basic social security system, he would resign. Combes would be replaced by former Prime Minister Maurice Rouvier from the Democratic Alliance Party. Rouvier would take a slightly more conservative stance on governance than Combes, as he would put an end to the failed trials of those involved in the failed 1899 coup by pardoning them, and he would deny government employees the chance to form public sector unions. However, he by no means abandoned the policies of his predecessor. The Rouvier government passed a few laws that Combes had failed to, such as a basic social security system for manual laborers, a law requiring assistance to be given to the sick elderly, as well as an 8-hour work week being established in the mines. In addition, Rouvier would target the army. Fears of the influence that the church had on the army had existed for a long time among the Republican political elite, and was one of the top personal concerns for the Left Bloc. To try to secularize the army, the government would reform the conscription system, forcing all able-bodied men to serve in the army for at least 2 years upon reaching adulthood, hoping that this would bring more secular men into the army. But deep fear the government had of Catholic officers specifically would lead to many of them being spied upon by the intelligence service, fearing they may be loyal to Rome over Paris. Rouvier would follow this up by passing a law that all these policies regarding religion had been building up to these previous 6 years, the separation of church and state law of 1905. This law had already been called for by Combes in September 1904 following a diplomatic incident with the Vatican, but the law would not be voted on until July of 1905 in the House and the following December in the Senate. The Radical Party had hoped for a stronger law, but it was slightly toned down by Rouvier and the Democratic Alliance. As passed, the law would force the church to relinquish all property, and instead it would be owned by the laity, although they would be free to let it be used for mass. Subsidies to the church, such as salaries being paid by the state, would be ended, and religious oaths and mandatory prayers would be eliminated from all government spaces. This law also enshrined religious liberty, with the authors of the bill arguing that the bill was in the interest of Catholics too. Many weren't convinced, however. The Rouvier government would soon be faced by a crisis as massive protests broke out over the law, and clashes between police forces and local Catholic protesters were common. Albert de Mun, the former monarchist leader, would even remark that France had fallen into civil war. The most famous of these clashes would take place in the village of Bosquet, where one of the protesters was killed inside the local church. The death would spark a heated debate in parliament, one that would cause the Rouvier government to collapse within a single day. The next government would be formed by Ferdinand Sarien, the former Minister of Justice. The government would largely be dominated by George Clemenceau, however, who would get his first chance to serve as a minister, attaining the interior portfolio. Sarien and Clemenceau recognized the necessity to make peace with the church and would begin a policy of appeasement. This policy would work as the church would reluctantly accept the separation, while the French government on the other hand would make priests eligible for pensions and would expand protections for personal religious worship in public. Sarien did not have much time to govern, however, as 2 months into his term he would have an election to fight off. While the term Left Bloc had stopped being in use to refer to the left-wing coalition, the same coalition continued in all but name, except that it had a new member now, a party called the Independent Socialists, being made up of a group of socialists who wanted to support the coalition. Its leader was Aristide Briand, who had been the principal author of the separation law. Speaking of socialists, in 1905 the two French socialist parties had finally decided to put aside their differences and unite, being under pressure from the Second Internationale. The new party would be called the French Section of the Workers' Internationale, or SFIO, and would form a unified socialist bloc with the exception of the independents. The party would be led by Jean Jaurès, as he was the only leader of the two parties who actually held a seat in parliament. On the other side of parliament, the Rump Progressives formed a new party in 1903, not long after the last election, calling themselves the Republican Federation. The party was conservative and Republican, similar to the Liberal Action, although it was less explicitly clerical and more conservative on economic matters. Going to the election, the clerical question would be the biggest debated issue, just as it had been in the last election, with the left standing firm on its policies while the right decried it as being the product of a secular tyranny. Now let's see the results! So it was at this point when I was writing the script that I realized I had completely forgotten to mention the nationalists. Well, to be fair, they haven't done much and didn't really matter. Anyway, they only won 30 seats without even clearing 6% of the vote. This was their worst performance yet, and they have nowhere to go but down from here. Anyway, onto the parties that actually matter. The left won big, and in a way not seen in decades, winning 357 seats, a clear mandate that would allow them to govern without any additional outside support. The relative stability of government since the last election helped the left maintain their support, while successfully concentrating their vote share to produce more seats. The right, on the other hand, suffered bigly. They fell down to just 144 seats, a far cry from the significant caucus they had attained in the last election. Neither of the parties in the coalition even managed to cross the triple-digit mark, with a radical party of its own winning almost as many seats as the whole coalition. The SFIO made good use of its new unity, as it gained 11 seats for a total of 54. Jules Guesde even managed to win back election to parliament after nearly 10 years of being seatless. It was nowhere near enough to form a government, but it was a solid achievement. Prime Minister Sarien would not resign immediately, as had happened in the previous two elections, but he stayed around for a while. He would only resign in October, citing his poor health. The next Prime Minister would be... no, it can't be! No, it's been so long, it just can't be. I don't believe it. No!